The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories helps businesses, nonprofits, and HR practitioners better manage the employee experience, providing the tools, training, and resources needed to get HR right. For more information, check out our website at theteam@hrstories.com. Each week on the HR Stories podcast, HR and leadership experts John Thalheimer and Chuck Smikian dive into the stories that matter most to you, our listeners. We have found that there is a lesson in every story. And now our host, John Thalheimer and Chuck Smikian. Welcome everybody to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. How are you doing today, Chuck?
I'm doing great, John. You were playing some fantastic music. Never heard it before. It reminded me of like the old new wave music of the 80s. That's what it kind of reminded me of.
Oh yeah,
maybe.
I can see that kind of rock lobsterish.
Yes, very rock lobsterish.
Yeah. So it was Scott Tournay. He used to be in the Grace Potter Nocturnals, and he has his first own album out called Cadillac. Definitely check it out, folks. That's my plug, my music plug for the day.
Yeah, check it out. Well,
out.
John, as we're heading into July here, we got the big news. The Department of Labor, the wage and hour threshold is going up. So that's big news.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because I was thinking about that, and I wanted to bring that up today because I'm, again, reading these articles, and there's a court case that will probably have happened by now, by the time we get this podcast out, where there are a few people that are trying to stop that. And it'll be interesting to see what happens and that kind of stuff. I'm telling all my clients, be prepared, figure out your plan. And again, it's going to impact every organization, every business a little bit differently. Some it's not going to impact at all. They're going to be like, yeah, whatever. It's not a big deal. Where other ones, I think it's going to impact a lot. And so just kind of figuring out your plan, like even if it's not going into effect, figure it out because this isn't the end of it, right? It's going to go on for a while. And so just be ready.
Absolutely. Well, lots of news, it's interesting. The news cycles, how they change and they adjust. And, sometimes you have a lot of compliance stuff. Sometimes you just have general HR news. And I was trying to think of a theme for today's story, and I was playing on different ideas. But I ended up not going with the ideas, but they were still great HR in the news. And one of them was about, I was going to do a story, I thought trust but verify. And what I meant by that is I ran up against a couple of situations. Specifically, Kronos had a big outage on their HR system about a year or so ago. And that is just a bunch of lawsuits that are being settled now. And then most recently, Paylocity, which is another HR system, is now being sued because they screwed up so badly that they weren't calculating the regular rate, that weighted overtime rate for a company called DrinkPack out in California. And in fact, they screwed up so many times that the DrinkPack ended up having wage and hour violations that they had to settle and pay for. They were sued twice by the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. So I guess the theme there, John, is trust, but you still have a responsibility to verify.
Yeah, I mean, this is a subject that comes up in my payroll workshops. And again, right? And one of the things I'm always telling people is like, your liability doesn't stop because you have somebody else doing it. Right? You still have the liability. You're still responsible for making sure to get right. And if you're assuming like, well, they're going to do it. They got it. We're going to do it. I just think that's naive. And I'm not like, I think they do their best to get things right. But again, trust and verify, as you said, Chuck. So I think that's really important. And calculating the overtime, the regular rate, is a subject that I teach in my workshops. And I will tell you, every time I teach it, 25% of people are like, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
like, you're in payroll, you should know this.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And so just being aware.
Absolutely. So I thought that was just interesting. And Paylocity is they're getting sued. They want this drink pack. And I got to tell you, there's only 364 employees in this drink pack company. So it's not like they got 3,000 and they couldn't verify. And they did say they attempted several times to get Paylocity to correct things. Paylocity said they would, and the errors kept persisting. But you know, when it happens once, twice, you just don't think, oh, they did it again. It's like you get on the phone, you're calling everyone, you're calling the whoever my rep is, my rep's right. You're getting to the top of Paylocity to fix these things. So, anyways, that's my that was the one angle that I was looking at. I thought that was kind of interesting. Trust, but you still have to verify. What do you got, John?
Again, following that liability, that's really important in there. I got a bunch of stories, and they're really kind of quick hits. So I just heard that Indeed is laying off 1,000 more employees. And so that's a big news, right?
No.
So Indeed is doing it, what's happening and that kind of stuff. And so that's big. And the other thing, the other one I want to mention, and then we can come back. But so we know that the Department of Labor has issued new guidance around independent contractors. What makes an independent contractor? What makes the employee? We kind of went back to the 6 economic factor reality. And Supreme Court kind of snubbed Uber because they had a court case that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, we're not hearing it. We're sending that back down to the courts. And the gist of it was that it was out in California, and one of the federal courts said the individual couldn't sue Uber for violating an independent contractor-employee relationship. And what happens, so they said individually, you can't do that. You have to go through arbitration. You signed that when you agreed, you have to go through arbitration. But what they did allow to go forward is a multi-individual lawsuit. And so that's now coming back, and it's more of a class. I don't know, class action is not the right word. A lawyer would shoot me for that. But again, more people are going in there. And so we have not yet heard the end of what is truly an independent contractor and what is not. Are an Uber driver, is a Lyft driver, a DoorDash driver. And so again, I'm telling everyone, go back. If you have independent contractors, audit them, and then look at the 3 tests: the Department of Labor, economic reality test, the ABC test for your state, and then also the IRS 20-factor test. And if, again, I think the hard thing is with independent contractors, there's no bright line, right? There's not a singular bright line that says, yes, they're an independent contractor. And so you have to be careful. You have to do it. And this is where I would advise you, if you're not sure, always go towards an employee, but always get an employment lawyer, because it's going to be different by state. It's going to be different there. And have somebody kind of go through it and go, okay, this is what it is and how we do it. So.
No, that's great. No, that's good stuff. And it's just so important to stay on top of those things, you know, because you know what? That stuff is not exciting. It's not sexy. You know, when it comes to HR stuff, it's not the exciting training stuff, and it's not the exciting, you know, I don't know, just whatever recruiting and just the things that a lot of HR people do. Some people love the compliance stuff, but some people, you know, they're like, it doesn't really affect us. Maybe it won't affect us. And so they kind of ignore it till it's too late. And speaking of fun, speaking of being yourself, I saw an article saying, you know, with company cultures, they're kind of relaxing and stuff, but still 41% of job seekers still say they are not comfortable being themselves at work because they believe a lot of their employers are discouraging them from talking about certain topics. And so I thought that was from Express Employment Professionals, and that was released this past month, June 2024. And they said part of the confusion is over workplace etiquette, saying that a lot of the job seekers and employees it's hard to know what is acceptable and unacceptable at work, which I thought that was kind of interesting, that people don't know what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I don't know if it's a generational thing, but I just found that to be interesting because, you want people to be authentic. You want them to enjoy themselves. Be yourself at work. Oh, but don't do that. Don't be that, And so, I've got mixed thoughts about that. Definitely talking politics at work, that causes problems and things. So I don't know, any thoughts on that about being yourself at work, bringing your authentic self, even if it doesn't fit or does fit? I just thought that was just interesting.
And again, right? I mean, one of the things. So if I'm an employee, I want to look for a culture that I can be me, right? I want to look for a culture and I can be me. And I've worked with and worked in many different cultures all the time. And I remember back in the day, you would literally put on your suit jacket, and then that would be that person you were going to be when you were at work. And people wouldn't know. I don't know what he likes. I don't know what, anything about that person. I think we've gone much farther than that. I think in a lot of places it is. You get to know people, you hang out with them. And I think all that's important. But what is that line, right? Again, I think we can't in the workplace be offensive to others. And I think some people are like, well, I want to say this, but I can't say that because that's going to offend other people around me. Well, isn't that like part of society? Isn't that part of civilization? I'm not going to agree with everything people in my neighborhood say. I'm not going to agree with everything people say at our workplace. And understanding that and go, okay, what can I do? And I do think people want to be a little more. I think there's been a lot of pushback to people, and certain people are like, well, you keep pushing me back, so I'm going to be out there. I'm going to talk about things, and right? And so they become boisterous and much more there, and then we're not having conversations.
Yeah. It's interesting. I like how you put that, is that back in the day, we would wear a tie, would wear a suit jacket, and that would be us at work. And then I'd always be surprised when there'd be an after work thing or someone, hey, we're going to do something a weekend at so-and-so's house. You'd go and you see like someone, they're all like, they got a different shirt on. They're wearing the baseball cap. They're like, yeah, this is me. And you're like, oh yeah, you're right. But it is interesting how with the workplace becoming more casual, especially with hybrid environments, that people still aren't comfortable being themselves at work. Although I will tell you, and I think you probably agree with this, is the companies that allow people to be more authentic at work probably overall have better cultures and maybe even better retention. So it's just a thought, food for thought today.
Yeah, it's so funny because I have a story. So I was doing coaching at a local company here in Nashville, a big HVAC company in Nashville, and they made a big change to allowing people in the office area, right, to wear jeans to work. And a lot of the senior leadership team started wearing jeans to work. And it was very off-putting for my coaching clients. They were like, no, you don't know what, you're wearing jeans. And like one of the leaders showed up to an award ceremony. And I think he had a jacket on, but he was wearing jeans. And they were all like, it was just like weird to see him in jeans and it's casual. And again, I think we always say that, like when I'm working with clients, you dress for the client, right? You dress for the client, you dress for the meetings you're going to have that day. And so I think, again, figuring out that right culture for your organization is really important. And knowing where the boundaries are, and HR has to enforce those boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I think that's important, right? And again, I'm just going, okay, we will allow this, but we're not going to allow this. And we've heard, right, 100 times where a company said, well, it's okay to, wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, but then somebody comes in with a Confederate flag and it's not all right. And then that just blows up in everyone's face.
Yeah, well, I was going to say HR enforcing boundaries is, I hate enforcing things. I'd rather hold people like consistent and say, okay, here's a policy, here's a practice. And I want you managers, we need to enforce it on down. So anyways, crazy stuff. Good stories. You got anything else for us before we launch into our
I do, and it's the perfect segue. It's the perfect segue. So I just read an article today that came out, and it says this. And HR people, I need you to listen to this one. All right, you're listening? Okay. Over 80% of workers are scared of the HR department.
Oh, no.
Yeah, right. And it says 85% workers said they've hesitated to discuss a work-related issue with HR, citing concerns about lack of confidentiality, perceived ineffectiveness in HR, fear of repercussions, and uncertainty about HR responses. And some 37% of workers said they just find HR workers to be unapproachable.
I could see that. I mean, I definitely could see that in places I've worked. That's why when I teach our HR classes for seminars and other things, I always tell our HR for HR people, get out, meet the hourly folks, let them see you, say hello to everyone. And eventually, when they see you and they're around you, they're not going to be as afraid of you, and they will start telling you things. And that's how you get that inside scoop to do your job.
Yeah, and I love that. And I know you, Chuck, right? You and I have had this conversation. You're down in Florida, and you're working at a resort, and you've done your best to get to know the individuals on a personal basis, right? And reaching out to them and talking to them using their names. And I think it's essential, if you're going to be in HR, you have to build trust with the employee base, right? You have to build trust. Yeah. And now I get it, right? There are certain things that we have to do, right? We don't like to do, holding boundaries, right? Enforcing boundaries. We don't like to do it, but that's part of our job. Sometimes we have to explain to the employees, hey, this is why we do this. We have to set boundaries, blah, blah, blah. We have to build trust up. And I don't think, and I read an article about this, and I remember being sort of like, no, I disagree. But now the more I think about it, I agree. The article was about the open door policy. Mm-hmm. And he was basically saying that the open door policy isn't working. And it's true, right? Because you think about a typical frontline employee, and you say, oh, my door is always open. Come on in anytime. They're not going to take advantage of it because there's a big boundary between you and them. And so, like, if I'm going down in Chuck's resort, I'm going to have to go through his offices back in the corner. And so I have to go there. And maybe I don't want my boss to see me. And then it goes by to two managers that work for Chuck. And now they're looking at me, right? And so Chuck's concept of getting out, walking about, and having conversation is critical. And so I love that you do that, Chuck. And I love that people should follow that lead, right? So you're building trust. They're going to get to know you. And then what you say, right? Then you're getting information. People are telling you things, and you're not like, it's not one piece of information that matters. It's 10, 20 pieces of information. Now you get the full picture of what's going on.
Yeah. I will tell you just one thing about what's going on in my office as HR director. It goes the other way too. People walk in all the time. Hey, it's Chuck here. It's Chuck here. It's Chuck here. So it gets to be a little overly open, but that's okay. But my HR manager, who's fairly new and still new in her career, she says, how come they always ask for you and they don't, I ask them if they need assistance, what can I do for them? And they're like, no, I need to talk to Chuck. And I'm answering simple questions. And I've started talking to her. I said, well, I think what you need to do is I need to get you out of the office more. I said, we need to they're more familiar with me because I'm out of the office a lot. I'm walking around, I'm talking, where I've been using her to kind of maintain the office so I can go out and take care of everything else. And I just realized while I'm doing her a solid by giving her that experience of being in the office and running things, she's not out in the employee population and building those networks and relationships. So I learned something this last week too, and this kind of reinforces those things. So thank you.
That's great,
John T.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm always here to coach you, Chuck.
There you
that's
go.
great. Yeah. So I know we have a couple stories today, right? 3 stories you're going to share with us. And I love this topic. I don't know if you want to drop something before we take our break, but maybe tease.
Sure. Well, it's all about that sex discrimination, gender harassment and discrimination, and people are like, oh boy, here we go again. But what you don't understand is the EEOC dropped new guidance just a few weeks or months ago, and the Supreme Court made some rulings that it changed the laws. And too many times employers still have their personal feelings on how they think things should be, but it may be illegal. So we're going to talk about that. And I've got some great examples.
All right. You've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. Hi, it's me, John, from the team at HR Stories. We are often asked, how do I get better at HR? The simple answer is by practicing it. But as with most things in life, it isn't that easy. We make the best HR decisions when we have the knowledge, the systems, and guidance in place. Chuck and I founded the team at HR Stories to help HR practitioners get HR right. We are passionate about giving you the tools to excel at your job. For more information about upcoming workshops, resources, and our latest blogs, check out our website at theteam@hrstories.com. Together, we are the team at HR Stories.
Welcome back to the HR Stories podcast. And John, I used this phrase a couple of weeks ago, and I can't get over it. I love it, but here it is. Where the drama of the workplace meets the gavel of the courtroom. I know. I'm your host, Chuck, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, the performance and coaching guru, John Thalheimer.
I like that every time we do one of these podcasts, you come up with another adjective to describe me.
You like that? You've noticed a theme, a pattern. That's good. That's good. That's good.
Noticed. Yeah.
All right. So today we have an especially important episode focused on recent updates from the EEOC that every employer and employee should know about. So as John and I, we talked a little before the break, and we've talked on several occasions, and I think I even wrote an article on LinkedIn a couple of months ago about this. The EEOC released new guidance on workplace harassment and addressed legal developments and emerging issues that weren't really around so much in 1964 and 74 and even 84. And that included virtual work environments, gender discrimination, and things like that, and was meant to help people feel safe on the job and assist employers in creating respectful workplaces. So it's a full, very long, has all kind of examples, and they came out April 29th. They called it the Enforcement Guidance on Harassment in the Workplace, and it consolidated all the previous updates, and they gave it kind of what they call a unified resource. And they actually had a lot of public input into this in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, when you're thinking about the EEOC, right, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which came out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, it protects employees from harassment based on race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, childbirth, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, disability age, and genetic information. Ooh, not to include a little veterans in there as well. This updated guidance is crucial in understanding how these protections are applied at work. And I think you're right? That environment is changing. And what we were thinking about in 1964, 1974, 84, 94, 204, things are different. We need to be paying attention. We need to know what to do and how to handle them.
Exactly. And today we're going to look at three, compelling stories that highlight the importance of these guidelines and the real world implications for employers and employees alike. And our first story takes us to Dothan, Alabama, Harmony Hospitality, which I relate to because I am in the hospitality business right now. And these folks were operating a Home2 Suites by Hilton Hotels, and they found themselves in hot water over sex discrimination claims. See, Harmony Hospitality faced allegations of sex discrimination after they terminated a night auditor. A night auditor is usually someone that comes in from about 11 at night to 7 in the morning. They usually work the front desk, but they also audit all the receipts and things like that for the day. So they're kind of night owls. Night auditors are odd ducks overall, but they have a they have a huge.
I worked overnight.
Okay.
I used to work the 11 to 7 shift at an AM/PM mini market in Pennsylvania. Long time ago. I was much younger than I am now. But yeah.
And you're not an odd duck.
I was kind of odd duck then, but I found it fascinating the people that were out between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., right? And my customers, I got to know a lot of them. Some of them were great. Some of them were odd ducks. Some of them were fantastic. I got to learn all about them.
Well, one thing about night auditors and even like you work at third shift is they have to be responsible. And they're usually very good employees because they're on their own. But they terminated this night auditor based on the employer's perceived femininity of this person and sexual orientation. Management observed him dressed in a manner that they deemed too feminine for a male employee, and they fired him just a few hours after learning he identified that he was gay, and he identified as more feminine. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what to say, Chuck. You know that drives me crazy. And again, I think about this in a lot of different manners, right? And I know we're going to get into this conversation, but I think a lot of times we have to go back and focus on one thing. Is the employee performing up to our expectations? And if not, then that's an issue. But if they are, nothing else matters. And so, again, it really doesn't matter what the management thinks of somebody because they're gay or they're feminine, right? Sorry. I won't get off my soapbox now.
Here's the deal. That's the only reason they fired him or that person. That's the only reason they fired this person. But it is illegal, and the EEOC stepped in, and they're charging Harmony right now with discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it does highlight how employers cannot impose gender stereotypes on their employees or discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity. 10 years ago, in a lot of the country, you really could. And then some states and some cities made it illegal, and then they've made it illegal nationally. But some of these folks are living in the past, and they're in the middle district of Alabama, and it pretty much overall, once again, underscores it is illegal for you as an employer to fire an employee because of their sex, which includes sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah, and I think we've had this conversation. What's fascinating is when you go back and look at the history of the Civil Rights Act, the way it was worded, and sex was not originally in the Civil Rights Act. It was added on the floor of the Congress. It was worded as sex versus the sex. And that little change opened it up for sexual orientation, gender identity, and all of that interpretation under the law. And I will say that, and I know you didn't mean it this way, but I want to reiterate, this is happening across the country, right? It's happening from Portland, Maine, down to San Diego, from Fairbanks, Alaska, down to Miami, Florida. It's happening across the country. And people need to be aware that this new guidance, this guidance is back, right? This is going back from the Supreme Court case in 2022, I think it was.
Yeah, Bostock and versus something.
Right.
Else.
So what was from them, and the Supreme Court says, hey, this is accepted, blah, blah. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to look at our policies. We need to get into all of that kind of stuff. Sorry, I took that a little different direction, but just
that's okay.
Yeah.
But we're going a different direction here. Geographically, we're going to Chicago now. And this was LAS Hardwoods. Yeah, LAS Hardwoods created a hostile work environment for a sales associate because of his sexual orientation. The employee faced frequent use of gay slurs and was harassed due to his perceived femininity. Despite his complaints, there we go. Despite his complaints, the company did nothing to stop the harassment. So once again, the EEOC has stepped in. They filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of Illinois, emphasizing in their lawsuit that workplace harassment based on sexual orientation is a violation of federal law.
Yeah, right. And so again, when an employer is not taking care of its employees, that's an issue. And so if you're being harassed, you have every right to go to your supervisor, go to your HR department and say, I'm being harassed, and they better take action.
Right. And that's right. And the case obviously reinforces the need for employers to actively prevent and address harassment.
Yeah, and so speaking of harassment based on sexual orientation, Chuck, the EEOC's guidance provides clear examples to help employers understand what constitutes such harassment, right? So you can go in there and literally go, oh, this is harassment, this isn't harassment, right? And they kind of go through all that.
Yeah, that's the unique aspect of this update, and that's a great point. One example the EEOC provided involves a staff journalist named Heidi. She attends a company award ceremony with her wife, Naomi. After the ceremony, a coworker named Trevor made inappropriate and offensive remarks about Heidi's sexual orientation, using slurs and sending her suggestive emojis. This is an example the EEOC says is of the kind of behavior that clearly constitute harassment based on sexual orientation.
I just want to jump in here because I think it's interesting, right? And it's not clear in their example, but it happened after award ceremony. And so did it happen outside of company, right? Did it happen outside of the company thing, right? And so again, harassment's harassment. And if you have a coworker harassing another worker at a company function or an award ceremony, that's still harassment and still needs to be addressed. Yep.
And that's a good catch and a good point. So our third story involves this company. It's an interesting name, CISPRO, like sister and brother, maybe. I don't know. CISPRO. Yeah. They're in Illinois, so they're up in that same part of the world in New Athens, Illinois, by the way, which faced out. Hello to our listeners in New Athens, Illinois, which includes the CISPRO family.
Our listener.
Or one listener, but they faced allegations of gender identity and discrimination and harassment. So the EEOC came in and charged CISPRO that CISPRO allowed a transgender employee to be harassed to the point of being forced to quit.
Constructive discharge. Dun, dun, dun,
Yeah.
dun. Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's obviously concerning. Should not make fun of it. So what happened in that case? What
Yeah.
happened?
So the transgender employee began her transition in 2018 and was subjected to frequent derogatory comments from the co-owner who refused to call her by her name, repeatedly misgendered her. Additionally, she faced aggressive sexual harassment from fellow employees, and despite reports, the co-owner took no action to address the harassment.
It's a clear example of how failing to address harassment can create a hostile work environment. And I also
Yeah.
think, and that's the owner, right? That's the owner. And, again, as a co-owner, like if I have a co-owner, we're two co-owners, it's hard to have those conversations, but those are the conversations that need to happen.
Yeah, and the EOC provided another example in their guidance that perfectly illustrates harassment based on gender identity. So in their example, they say there's this person named Chloe, a purchase order coordinator at a retail store warehouse, harassed by her supervisor after she disclosed she was transgender. The supervisor not only made inappropriate comments about her gender identity, but also enforced different dress codes and misgendered her repeatedly. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and unlawful. And just for our listeners, misgendering is we're going to talk more about it, and that's illegal. But that's where someone says, "Well, I am a she, I am a he," but you always refer to them at the opposite. Like, oh, they're not a she, they're a he. What's he doing now? What's he doing now? Hello, Mr. So-and-so. And that's called that's an example of misgendering.
So Chuck, can I ask you a question about that? Because what happens if I have an employee that's transitioning from he to she? And I'm doing my best, right? I'm helping them. I'm doing whatever I can. I'm supporting them. But occasionally I slip up. Occasionally I'll say he when I should say she. Is that legal? Is that illegal? Am I going to get in trouble for doing that?
You know what? It's funny. I do address that a little later in our story.
Oh, okay.
And the EEOC actually specifically, John, addresses exactly what you just brought up in your concerns. So,
okay, we'll get to it.
Yeah, yeah, we're going to get to it. So, but now that we've heard these stories, I just want to discuss those broader implications. The EEOC updated guidance emphasized, and I'm going to bold and underline and give you 25-point font here. Well, 24-point, I guess. Employers cannot rely on personal beliefs or biases to justify discriminatory practices. So you cannot rely on personal beliefs or biases to justify discriminatory practices. And it's important and it's crucial for employers to understand those guidelines and create those inclusive workplaces.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we need to emphasize that, right? Because the employer's personal beliefs is different than how the law plays out here, right? And so employers are also not allowed to segregate employees based on actual perceived customer preferences. For example, it would be discriminatory to keep LGBTQ plus employees out of public-facing positions or to direct these employees toward a certain store or geographical location. Prohibiting a transgender person from dressing or presenting consistent with that person's gender identity would constitute sex discrimination as well. But look, this is not about avoiding the law. We know that inclusive workplaces produce better results. Period. And so employers need to realize that protecting their employees' rights can increase outcomes, right? Increase better outcomes doing that as well. And I think employees have to understand that they have a right to come forward. I know it's difficult. I know it can be really hard, but you have a right to come forward, talk to your HR person, and if you're not getting satisfaction there, call the EEOC, go to their webpage. They have lots of great process on that.
Yeah. So to recap for our listeners, and I'm going to break it down a little further and address your question. It's unlawful to subject an employee to workplace harassment that creates hostile environment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Harassment, once again, can include offensive, derogatory remarks about sexual orientation, being gay or straight. Harassment can also include, for example, offensive or derogatory remarks about a person's transgender status or gender transition.
And let's not forget, right? The harasser can be the victim supervisor, of course, a supervisor in another area, a coworker, or someone who is not an employee of the employer, such as a client or customer. What about offhand remarks? Oh, well, let's go back to it, Chuck. So what about offhand remarks? Can you really dive into that now?
Sure. So the accident and the EOC actually, I lifted off their specific guidance here. And they say, although accidental misuse of a transgender employee's name and pronouns does not violate Title VII, intentionally and repeatedly using the wrong name and pronouns to refer to a transgender employee could contribute to an unlawful hostile work environment. In fact, while the law doesn't really prohibit simple teasing, offhand comments or isolated incidents that aren't very serious, right? Because some people are like, well, I like to joke and, that sort of thing. And maybe there might be some, I don't know, offhanded, simple teasing, but it is unlawful when it's frequent or severe, or John, if someone says stop, that's inappropriate and it creates that hostile work environment up to an adverse employment decision where someone is fired or demoted.
Yeah, right. And so, again, best practice is if someone complains, you need to figure out what's going on, right? You need to investigate. You need to take it seriously. You need to document, because maybe it's one time. But maybe it's one time from Joe and one time from Julie and one time from Joel. All of a sudden now it's creating a hostile work environment for that individual who's hearing those complaints from a lot of different places. And so what are some of the best practice that employers can implement to avoid these pitfalls?
Sure. So all these guidelines on gender harassment, discrimination, it's a new playing field, okay? So you've really got to educate yourself, then train your managers. Make sure management at all levels understand what we're talking about and what this is all about so they don't fall into these pitfalls. Provide that training on recognizing and addressing discrimination and harassment, focusing on sexual orientation and gender identity. You want to make sure your policies are updated and they are clear. You want to implement and enforce anti-discrimination, anti-harassment protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And if you see it, you do need to say something. And I'm speaking to all of our leaders out there, all of our managers, and specifically our HR folks. You want to establish a reporting mechanism, and we talk about that quite frequently in all of our conversations regarding harassment, including sexual harassment, but create that safe and confidential process for employees to report discrimination and harassment and ensure that they can do it without fear of retaliation and, of course, foster that inclusive culture of respect where employees feel valued, accepted for who they are, encourage that open dialogue, and really always monitor the workplace for any signs of discrimination or harassment, and you need to address them promptly.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, Chuck. And I think you really laid it out. Hey, what do we need to do? How do we need to do this? And it's not one person, right? It's not just the HR department. It's not just the managers. It's not just the leaders. All of those three and other employees really need to embrace this and make sure that we are creating that culture where people do feel safe, they do feel respected, and they know that their rights are going to be protected. Because here's what's going to happen. If you don't they're going to go to their HR person. And if that doesn't work, they're going to go directly to the EEOC and you're going to get a complaint. And whether it's completely valid or maybe a little gray area, you're going to be investigated. And if you take any adverse action against that employee, retaliation, you're going to end up with a big fine.
Yeah. And at this point in the podcast, there's probably some, you liberal, pinko, blah, 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 liberal this, I don't care. You know what? It doesn't matter what you think. If you fail to implement and uphold these standards, you risk legal action.
Yeah, 100%, right?
Simple. Yeah.
And it was funny because, I was doing a virtual presentation and Todd was my assistant. I don't know if that's the right word, but he was my moderator. And he brought that up. He was like, look, it doesn't matter whether you agree with the law or not. It's the law and we need to follow it. If you want to change it, go change it. But you need to follow the law. And sometimes we'll look at the law from our perspective. We're like, why? That doesn't make sense and that kind of stuff. But it's the law, right? And so whether you're in HR, management, or an employee, it's essential to understand your rights and responsibilities in all of these situations.
Yeah, we hope today's episode sheds lights on the complexities of navigating the new EEOC guidelines, the importance of protecting employee rights. And so, hey, join us next time because there will always be a next time as we explore another intriguing case with valuable lessons for the workplace.
Yeah, and I want to say, we really focused today on sexual harassment, gender identity, transgender, but the EEOC guidelines talk about race, color, national origin, right? And so they give us tons of examples to make sure that we have it. So I would definitely recommend that you get it, look at it, spend some time with it, and really understand how that's going to impact your workplace. Maybe you need to change policies. Maybe you need to do training. Chuck and I would be happy to come into your organization and do training for your leadership team around this subject so they feel comfortable, they know how to address it. And so don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more stories and updates in the world of HR. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, feel free to reach out. Until then, remember, this is the HR Stories podcast, where there is always a lesson in every story. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we are providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories broadcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.